let's continue with our coverage of the situation at The Hague. Israel accusing South Africa of making outlandish allegations against the country as it puts up a defense in the genocidal intent case currently unfolding at the International Court of Justice. We know that South Africa, of course, is asking for emergency measures to be put in place to essentially prohibit Israel from moving in on the city of Rafah, which it says, South Africa that is the last stronghold or the last point of refuge for Palestinians in the besieged Strip. Let's continue getting reaction to what's taking place as the hearings, by the way, continue at The Hague. Bring in once again Dr. Mia Swart, who's a visiting professor at the Wits School of Law. Dr. Swart joins us via our video link at this hour. Great to see you again, Dr. Swart. Thanks very much indeed for making time. There's a quote as I was writing vigorously here in my notes that stood out for me from Israel, saying that South Africa is essentially trying to compel the court to micromanage an operational aspect of armed conflict. Essentially, the picture that Israel is painting is that there's a very devastating war taking place, and when that happens, there will be casualties. However, as far as Israel is concerned, that does not equate to a genocide.
The problem with what you have just stated is that, once an operation results in that many casualties, it is tremendously problematic. And it is in fact precisely the task of the court to manage such a conflict, manage it in a way that respects humanitarian law, because we know that Israel has not been respecting humanitarian law. The opening speaker this morning referred to international humanitarian law, but in the first hour of the proceedings, there was no further reference to rules of international humanitarian law. And we know that first and foremostly, Israel is violating the principle of distinction. It is not distinguishing between civilians and non-civilians. So Israel started the morning by using words like outrageous and lies, and is accusing South Africa of all manner of things, but it is not sticking to the real point, which is international humanitarian law.
Yeah. Does it matter at all that Israel is saying that it too is still actively under siege? You know, they're saying that, for instance, in just the last week alone, about 200 rockets were fired specifically from Rafah. And in fact, if it weren't for their own interception, they'll also had a number of casualties on their end of this conflict. Does that matter at all?
Well, it matters, but it matters in the sense that the casualties have been, on the various sides cannot even be compared because, there's such a gross disproportion. We are talking about 1,300 casualties on the Israeli side and now more than 35,000 on the Palestinian side, not counting the bodies under the rubble. So in terms of violating, every principle of proportionality as well under humanitarian law, from that point of view, it matters.
A sticking point, it appears, at least insofar as Israel is concerned, is this idea of the release of hostages. We know there had been a number of attempts to reach some kind of ceasefire deal. And if my memory serves, the last proposal, I think, was rejected. Israel is essentially saying if Hamas were to agree to let go of the 220-odd people that it captured during its October 7th attack, this war will be over tomorrow. Is it that simple from your end?
Well, certainly it does not seem that simple from the Israeli end, because we know that Israel has been presented with various ceasefire proposals over the last months, and it has not agreed to a single one. It accuses Hamas of not agreeing to ceasefires, which is not true. Hamas has agreed to at least 2 or 3 ceasefire proposals, but every time we saw that the sticking point was that Israel would not finally agree to those. So for Israel to say this morning that they are interested in peace makes no sense in terms of the continuous large-scale killing. They're killing civilians, and there is no way, semantic way of around this. There's no way of making it look better. There's no way of focusing on technicalities. The disproportion in human life is far too great.
Yeah. You speak about technicality. We had always, I suppose, in some ways expected a discussion around jurisdiction, right? We know the ICJ is essentially put together to adjudicate over disputes between two countries. The last time there were oral submissions, Israel essentially argued that there was no dispute between itself and South Africa. Essentially for them, the issue here is about Israel and Hamas. We know Hamas is not a state, and therefore the jurisdiction issue gets muddied. I want to just take us back to the words of Gilead Noam, who was the first representative of the Israeli government, as he spoke specifically to this issue. Take a listen.
South Africa is suggesting a convoluted reading of international law, under which any armed conflict could be brought before the court. It seeks, once again, to obtain provisional measures that would bind only Israel and not its adversary. The absurd result would be that Israel would be denied its inherent right to defend itself. Hamas, for its part, would remain free to continue committing its horrific crimes. The purpose of the Genocide Convention is not to have the court supervise the conduct of armed hostilities by parties to the conflict, by the assertion of a genocide. Rather, the Convention, and subsequently this court's jurisdiction, is limited to the grave crime of genocide. I am compelled to restate once again that there is a tragic war going on, but there is no genocide. Yet, particularly at the provisional measure stage, when the evidentiary threshold is such that the applicant is not required to provide proof of its allegations or the existence of specific intent to commit genocide, there is a danger that the court will find itself engaged in the micromanagement of operational aspects of an armed conflict. This is what South Africa has been asking the court to do. Judge ad hoc Barak warned precisely of this danger when the court handed out its decision on South Africa's third request for provisional measures. He observed that, I quote, "The court has accepted South Africa's invitation to become the micromanager of an armed conflict and used the Genocide Convention as an excuse to rule on the basis of international humanitarian law. Managing an armed conflict under the Genocide Convention is a dangerous endeavor, especially when one of the belligerents is not a party to the convention. This remains true when considering South Africa's fourth request."
All right, that was quite a mouthful, but I was just trying to point us to that aspect around jurisdiction, Dr. Swart. Does Israel have a point here, right? Even if the court were to find against the country, who holds Hamas accountable and forces them to cease their attack?
Well, the ICJ has jurisdictional rules. It investigates the question of jurisdiction when it decides whether to admit a matter, when it decides whether to have, hearings on a matter. So this has already been decided by the ICJ, and I would not question the ICJ on this. It's very rigorous in regard to this kind of test. It is the principal judicial arm of the United Nations. It's the most highly respected international court. I would not question the ICJ's call on this. And we know that Palestinian statehood has been recognized by many, many countries and is advancing at a swift speed. So if that is the matter, then increasingly, this matter has every right to be heard by the ICJ. Israel is clearly grasping at technicalities once again. I think it is deplorable and really sad that there is not even some small recognition of the tremendous loss of life.
I have heard, especially from yesterday into today's arguments, questions being raised about whether or not this court has been afforded the ability to peruse objective evidence. Which, and I'm not quite sure how we define that, quite frankly, in a context where journalists are not allowed to really do their work in Gaza because of the ongoing assault, right? But anyway, the point being made here is that South Africa is relying on questionable evidence which was given to the United Nations, and therefore the court isn't able to make an objective finding. I wonder how much credence you reckon that has?
I don't think it has much credence because we see the world's most respected international media outlets, such as the BBC, such as CNN, such as Al Jazeera, all showing the tremendous loss of life in real time, directly. So if Israel does not accept that, this does not mean very much, because, highly credible media organizations that triple check their facts show this. We see victims showing atrocities directly on their cell phones. There is so much now. There's an overwhelming amount of evidence. And we know that, contrary to what was stated this morning, Israel does not respect freedom of speech. It recently banned Al Jazeera. So they simply have no leg to stand on. They will not accept any form of evidence, and they are blocking independent investigators. They are blocking prosecutors. They are blocking NGOs from collecting evidence, from sometimes even entering Gaza. So, they, again, grasping at technical straws.